Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Emerging Egypt, a virtual conversation on soy exports and the global marketplace with the Illinois Soybean Association. I'm Rhiannon Branch, anchor and reporter for Brownfield Ag News, and joining me today are three panelists. We have Mark Reed, who is a farmer from Putnam, also serving as an ISA director, ISA trade analyst Eric Woody, and ISA's Director of Public Policy and Market Development, Mr. Andrew Larson. We'll be answering questions from the audience throughout our conversation today. You can submit those through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time, and we will get to those either during the program or at the end before we finish up. So to kick things off, we'll start with Andrew. Can you go ahead and speak to the growing amount of soy exports to Egypt over the past few years and why Egypt has emerged as a large and important soybean market?
Sure, thank you, Rhiannon. And I really think the most interesting thing we do as an organization is watch where these new markets develop. And sometimes they take years and years and years to get there, and sometimes they happen overnight. Going back just a couple years to 2017, we know that there was the bumper crops in Illinois in 2017 and 18, a lot of crops exported out of the US, and we were looking for new markets continually. At that time, we were sending China was buying almost 100 million metric tons of soybeans a year, and the world thought China would always be buying every soybean we could get them. Well, a year later, we had a little trade dispute with China, and at the same time, other markets were continuing to grow. And it really timed up very well that Egypt as a country had been building out some crush facilities, both domestically produced from domestic companies like Alex Seed, a corporation based out of Alexandria, and even ADM and Cargo have a joint venture crush facility in Egypt. Egypt been a customer for soybean meal for a long time, but really kind of exploded overnight with this opportunity of the new expansion of the crush industry in Egypt. That timed up well for US growers because when we were sending less soybeans to China during the trade war, we had that opportunity of Egypt, of course, taking bulk freight out of New Orleans and going east instead of west, going through the Panama Canal, heading through the Mediterranean and delivering those soybeans to Egypt. And that market's grown from being way down on the list towards the bottom in terms of whole country customers for whole soybeans to being the number 3 independent country in terms of export markets currently for US soybeans. So really dramatic growth overnight and driven by that domestic crush industry and that growth in a country that made the decision to produce more of its own high quality protein in the country to feed more of its population, and timed up well for US producers because we had beans to supply in the market and they were looking for them. So that was really a strong, that's kind of how the story originated, and hope to continue working on that relationship in years to come.
There's definitely a lot to watch there on the trade front. Mark, can you talk about what factors are important in an emerging market like Egypt and how we kind of balance the importance of maintaining those traditional markets while still watching those emerging markets?
Yes, we mostly have to do both. One factor in the emerging markets, we have to help them a little bit more. I guess I would compare it to like when 50 years ago when we had the cooperative extension and land grant colleges and how they kind of helped in educating us to be better farmers. Well, this we need to do over there with the developing countries to help give them technical assistance and to their millers and processors and food products people. So I think that's most important. Also, just establish those relationships. Right now, we have like 80% of what they've imported in soybeans have been from the United States. This is, I think, the last 4 or 5 months. And we want to keep that relationship as key. We're able to deliver a good product timely. And so we've got to keep everything up so that we can continue to do what we're doing, and we just have to spend more time with the emerging markets, basically, to make them work. But we don't want to ignore our customers either. China, for example, they have imported, I think, 25% of Illinois soybeans. Every soybean grown, 25% of them go to China. So, when they had the trade war going on, you eliminate a quarter of our soybean exports, and we're in trouble as a soybean producer. So we've got to maintain, say, China, Mexico, also on the containerized shipments. We have to continue doing a good job working with them, and that would be mainly going to like Indonesia, Taiwan, Thailand, Malaysia, some of those countries. And those are some of them that we've concentrated during this trade war and developed a little more communications with them. So I think it's just the key to keep them growing. And since they have a demand for whole soybeans, Illinois Soybeans has a good handle on being able to provide that.
Eric, strategically, why is Egypt the country that's gaining a lot of attention in Africa?
It's, as Andrew and I think Mark alluded to a little bit, it's about growth, timeliness that the U.S. was able to really take advantage of in the last 5 years, mostly related to kind of anticipating some of their growth. It works really well to be kind of at the early stages of this and fostering these relationships to be able to kind of be the first to these markets, to make sure that you're providing good quality, consistent supply. And let's be honest, we have to have competitive pricing. So we've been able to do that really well. Egypt is a really outstanding example of that, and being a part of that growth as they've seen, even despite the pandemic, an increase in their GDP about 3.6% last year. So they're kind of leading the region around that area to kind of continue some of this growth. So the U.S. has just done an outstanding job of seeing and anticipating that developing region. And I think there's more exciting things going on along, but it definitely looks like Egypt is leading the way. And luckily, U.S. supply chain has been there throughout. And as Mark mentioned, we're, in the mid 80s as far as what's being imported there from a percentage standpoint in soybeans. So we really want to continue fostering that. We want to be with those folks all along. So as far as the supply chain is concerned, as long as we're developing direct, constant relationships with those folks, I think we're leading the way.
For Andrew, what role does Egypt play in feeding the rest of that region?
Sure. So one of our true partners in soybean exports here in the U.S. is our national affiliate, the United States Soybean Exports Council, and they call it the MENA, Middle East North Africa region. And Egypt is obviously the centerpiece of that region, which includes obviously Algeria and Syria, Israel, Lebanon, other countries to the east, as well as a few countries farther to the west as well in Africa. And that region has a lot of people in it. We sometimes don't consider how many people live in the region, but it's one of the more heavily populated in the world. And of course, it's a region that in some of the countries are very developed and have larger GDPs and the ability to larger middle classes to consume more meat protein, whether that's poultry or fish, even beef in some cases. And Egypt has made the conscious decision as a country to obviously grow out their protein production. And in the Nile River Delta, or Nile River Valley, being able to use that water asset to feed poultry and aquaculture operations there. They've, with the goal of being self-sufficient, but really they also have somewhat of a goal of helping sustain their own industry by exporting some of that feed, some of the protein to the rest of the region. We know they are sending product to Syria and other countries in the eastern part of that kind of Middle East, North Africa region, and certainly have potential to grow even more in the years to come, given their geographic location and the advantages they have.
Now, I didn't hear you say pork in that lineup, and that is because Egypt is a Muslim country. They don't consume pork. Eric, can you talk to us about how that impacts their soy consumption?
Yeah, absolutely. That's been one of the really exciting pieces. What you've seen a real growth and focus on in the region is a couple of other points in poultry and aquaculture, and just seeing such great growth there. A lot of really large commercial entities have been involved with meeting those demands that they've seen increase with increasing populations, with improvements in their overall economic situation, to where people are expecting more proteins. And those proteins are going to be coming from other sources, right? They're going to be coming from poultry, aquaculture, and in developing some newly, their diet tends to be a little more unique from what we're accustomed to in some parts of the US. So understanding those well, helping to assist where soy can be a leader in those diets, which I think it is pretty evident in as much as we're importing over the last couple of years and seeing those increases, that soy is really leading the way in meeting that new increasing protein demand, and we're reaching consumers there at a pretty high level.
For those who are just joining us for the Emerging Egypt conversation, we are going to be accepting questions from the audience. You can submit those at the bottom of your screen through the Q&A function at any time. Next up, we are going to talk to Andrew about what is driving Egypt's preference for U.S. soy, and maybe why U.S. soybeans versus, say, Brazilian soybeans.
Well, I think we talked a little bit at the opening about how when Egypt came online as a market, it really timed up well with the availability of U.S. soybeans coming out of the Gulf. It was a time when obviously China was much more dependent on buying Brazilian soybeans because of the trade war with the United States, and U.S. beans were somewhat of a discount on the open market versus Brazilian beans in terms of availability, and that really helped cement that relationship, cement that drive to bring the product from the U.S. to Egypt. And I think what that did was it developed business relationships with U.S. exporters. We know that a group of companies like ADM, who have that joint venture crush facility in Egypt with Cargill, they have a Switzerland-based commodity marketing business, and sometimes they bring Brazilian beans through that to customers around the world, but they also bring U.S. beans. And it's been easier for some of those desks to be able to push U.S. beans out of New Orleans because they've been able to reliably get there over the last few years. And I think one of the things that's been told to us by other folks in Egypt is that there is a preference for, not just Egypt, I guess in the whole world, is that U.S. beans and the Brazilian beans have slightly different characteristics. While sometimes Brazilian beans may be slightly higher in protein, that's something we hear sometimes from foreign buyers. We also know that there's different soil chemistry, different soil types in Brazil versus the U.S. They have more clay in their soil, which tends to be, sometimes there's a red tint to some of the oil that comes out of the soybeans. And whereas I think we need to talk about domestic or market consumption of what folks use soybeans for. In the U.S., we use about half of our soybean oil in the food industry. In a lot of these countries that buy whole U.S. soybeans, the reason they buy beans is they want both. They want the meal to feed protein to develop poultry and aquaculture, but they also really want the oil because it's heavily used in the food and human consumption areas as well. And when something has a color you're not a little bit used to, I think that potentially has some off-putting effects for whether consumers want to buy the product. So having a slight red tint to the product, I think, is just one harder step for some business entities in Egypt to sell that product if it were sourced in Brazil. I mean, obviously they will, because in the commodity world, price is king and availability is king. But definitely having that preference from Egyptian consumers for having a product that looks like it's supposed to and not have a little bit of red tint is certainly helpful. So really, to answer your question in a nutshell, it's been business opportunities that folks can help market to consumers in Egypt based on some of the quality and differences between U.S. and Brazilian soybeans, but also that business relationship that I know folks at like USAC are working very aggressively to help connect and educate some of these end users of soybeans in the country about U.S. soy, and specifically the values that it has.
Mark, let's kind of take a ride next to a soybean here for a minute and tell us how they're transported from the U.S. to Egypt, what modes are used and what routes are taken.
Okay, I'll take you basically from the farm to Egypt, if that's what you'd like. Basically, we truck them from the field, put them in a soybean bin, and then we take them out of that bin and truck them to the Illinois River, which is only about 10, 15 miles from most of our farms. So we've got a built-in advantage of having the waterway system right there. They're loaded on a barge. They're headed through the Lock and Dam system in Illinois, going down to the Mississippi River, end up in New Orleans, and then transferred into an ocean-going vessel, going through the Gulf of Mexico, over the Atlantic, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and into the Mediterranean, and then to Egypt. And then Egypt, they'll go to a crushing facility, which they'll be making meal or oil out of, and then they'll be distributed to their aquaculture industry, which is mainly tilapia at this point. And they're expanding that into shrimp and some other fishes, I guess, and also into poultry, which is mainly for chickens. And then the oil will go into cooking oil and processors. So that kind of takes it from our field all the way to putting it to their use.
Mark, on the topic of infrastructure, we're going to talk about, the potential for the growth of the market in Egypt. Do you feel that infrastructure is up to date in these areas to handle these increases?
I would say that it's not up to date. It did improve last year. We repaired some locks that were in desperate need of repair. That at least was accomplished and is better than it was. But we really need locks that are maybe 120 foot long. And so a barge doesn't have to hook up and unhook, go back through the lock again. And barge is the most economical way to transport goods. We use less fuel there compared to trucks, railroads. So why not make it more efficient? So what I would encourage all farmers to do is to contact your legislators. And when this infrastructure package gets passed, we need some of that money to improve our waterway systems. So I think now is a good time to get on the horn and let your people know that for agriculture, this might be the most important long-term wealth stimulus package that we need.
Well, let's go ahead and dive into what soy is being used for in Egypt. We have a question from Bill in the audience asking about aquaculture and how much influence that might have on soybean products imported from the US. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about aquaculture in Egypt. And I believe Andrew is going to touch on that.
So aquaculture overall in the world is really a fascinating and growing use for soy. And it's really an example, I think, of where groups like United Soybean Export Council is engaged with putting expertise on the ground of how to do some of these things. Because obviously fish aren't naturally bred to eat soybeans, right? We know that has to take some adoption to get it. And they have a system they like to call the in-pond raceway system, which uses less area to actually produce, put that feed into ponds to have higher production of aquaculture. And I think its USAC's work has been with a lot of specific Egyptians, aquaculture producers. And we know that in a lot of diets around the world, fish is a greater part of it than it is here in the US. Mark mentioned tilapia being a key part of that, being key whitefish. Shrimp is another species that's taken very effectively to this in-pond raceway feeding system. And it really is that potential for growth around the world. USAC, as a partner, has been engaged in China and other countries in Asia of developing this in-pond raceway technology for over 20 years, and has seen rapid growth and adoption of it. And that's been really kind of the nucleus for bringing some of that technology and that teaching and learnings to Egypt through their Soy Excellence Center that we're supporting there to help Egyptian aquaculture producers get off the ground, help them improve their operations. It's about 20% of the Egyptian soybean meal demand is currently supported by aquaculture. And I think around the world that number is expected to grow, not just in Egypt, as aquaculture is seen in these fish product, seafood products, whether it is fin fish or some of these other shellfish products or shellfish species, are seen as a very cost-effective protein source in a lot of these markets going forward. So it's really a true success story of how the soybean industry has worked to come up with kind of a new innovative feeding technology to use that meal and feed it in ponds and help on the ground producers in those countries use more of our product to feed out something that's going to help feed the rest of their country and their population.
Sorry, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but Mark, can you talk about the uses for soybean oil, soybean meal in Egypt, and kind of the growth of their crushing industry over there?
Well, we've been fortunate that they've increased their crushing capacity. A part of that's due to a agreement between ADM and Cargill to jointly start a crushing facility there. So now we do have more crushing capacity there where we can ship our whole soybeans from Illinois directly there, and they crush them, and then part of that will go to your cooking industry for the oils, and then the meal. And I don't know I think that the aquaculture industry, their diet is about 35% soybean meal, isn't it? Eric maybe could confirm that, but they use a lot, and the poultry also uses, I think, a similar amount of protein in their diet from soybean meal. So those are our two main sources that they want the protein for, or the soy for.
Eric, do you have anything more to add on the use of soybeans for the poultry industry in Egypt?
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit, and Mark did just now perfectly as well. That's, pretty foundational as we've seen increases for poultry, for fish. What we have to understand and remember, the exciting part of this market specifically is, we're still only a few years into this. A lot of their usage and understandings for feeding and the development of that is still going on. That as this sort of switch got turned on and they started importing a whole lot of soybeans, they're still learning. And a big part of that is some of the work done from USEC, from ISA, and in getting close to these markets. But the exciting part is that they're still learning. They're still going to increase. The expectation is that they're still going to increase their usages as consumers start to utilize more and start to enjoy more of these proteins. The expectation is that we'll see some really consistent growth, not only in poultry, but in all the other sectors that we kind of talked about. So I think that's the really exciting part about this specifically, in this market specifically.
I think Eric brought up something really key there, with how this industry is being built from the ground up in Egypt. They didn't have this extensively built out aquaculture and poultry industries, and this is not only is their import of soybeans new to them, some of this growth and expansion potential in those industries is new to them as well. So that does obviously provide a lot of opportunity, and we don't know what the full extent of that's going to be yet, but certainly is very promising, knowing that in the U.S. we're a developed market. We had poultry and pork industries for a long time, and they consume a lot of our soybeans, and they will continue to, and we very much service that market. But as this growing industry develops in a major market around the world, that's an exciting opportunity for soybean demand.
Andrew, we had a question submitted by Kurt asking what the demand is for non-GMO and organic soybeans.
So I think the bulk of our exports to Egypt are what they call conventional GM soybeans. I think as these markets grow out and you see potential growth in them, there's always an increased demand as populations become more developed. You see higher middle class incomes for some of the non-GM and specialty products. So there probably will be demand for that at some point down the road in Egypt. But currently it's a conventional commodity serviced market. They're a volume customer right now. But there's always that potential they could grow into being one that would certainly service or require a lot more non-GM and other specialty soybeans to help feed specific purposes. We know that a lot of the food grade organic soybeans grown here in the US go to serve food markets in Asia, so tofu and those type of products that are certainly very specialized, very much culturally centered food products in Asia. There are some vegetable protein products, obviously, in Mediterranean cuisine. Not a lot of them have traditionally involved soybeans, but that certainly is a potential market down the road as well.
Just want to remind attendees that you can submit questions at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A function, and we'll be sure that one of our panelists is able to answer that for you. Mark, switching over to you, as a farmer, why do investments in export markets like Egypt gain priority by the Illinois Soybean Association?
Well, we see that as a future market that's going to give us the most bang for the buck. We're going to continue raising more soybeans, raising our yields. I mean, years ago, we were satisfied with a 45, 50 bushel yield. Now we're disappointed if we only get 45 or 50 bushel. So we're going to continue to grow more. We have the capacity to grow more. There's more acres that can be taken away from corn or wheat. But as farmers, we want the best markets we can get. And that's kind of our job as, at least my job as a soybean director, to determine where the best place to put those checkoff dollars is. And we've got just a fantastic staff that have done a lot of work on this. And as just a one-year member, it looks like our soybean money has been put to great use. And we do need Illinois Soybean Association and American Soybean Association and USAC just does a tremendous job. So as farmers, we just have to support. We're not so good at marketing ourselves as farmers. You know, we're kind of laid back and just do the work. And we need people like Illinois Soybean Association looking after our export markets.
Eric, we're going to get out the crystal ball here. A few years down the road, how does the Egyptian market look? I mean, what kind of expansion is expected for Egypt in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, this is, you know, when you look at the charting of kind of imports, particularly soybean imports from the US over the last 5 years, you're hard pressed, I think, to find similar growth. So I think there's a lot of really involved groups like ISA, like USEC, that are working hard to ensure that we continue to see that, to manage through that growth. You know, the benefit is not only is that happening, but at a commercial level, as already kind of has been mentioned, ADM, Cargill have been highly invested in those markets. And let's be honest, those groups don't tend to get involved too often unless there is true potential growth. You know, that's certainly not an overnight scenario for a lot of those folks. So I'd love to have a crystal ball. I think the really smart people on the ground in Egypt and in the region really feel like we're going to see some sustained growth, really kind of because of what Andrew and I touched on a little bit earlier, is we're really at the infancy sort of stage of kind of how well soy is developing there, how consumers are responding so positively. And it's not just Egypt. I think Egypt is driving this region. So I think we're going to see this sort of trickle into the overall region as you see those positive impacts in Egypt and other parts that are kind of close around and can match some good logistics. Some of those folks are really good at getting products kind of anywhere in the world. So as they start to go into these points a little bit more, consumers start to enjoy them more, I really think we're going to see some sustained growth. Again, we've seen some really exciting percentages over these last 5 years. So it's our job as being involved with the supply chain in the way we are, and developing these relationships and making sure that we take good care of these markets, and we're leading the way along with our partners to make sure that that growth continues. It's essential.
Eric, along those lines, James from the audience has asked how the potential growth looks for Egypt compared to Western Africa that we've kind of been looking at.
Yeah, Western Africa is one of those that are similar. They're at some of these early onset stages. There's some different developmental and some cultural aspects in some of those points, but there's some absolute similarities. So some of those points are at the early pieces. I think the idea from a supply chain standpoint is as we get further into these regions and we develop these markets, in more advanced ways, that we will see some slow growth in those parts as well. There's Egypt is one of those that is kind of at the tops of this early lead, but I think we're going to see similar developments. I tend to think you won't probably see the massive growth that you have seen in such a short term, but if you look on a longer scale, it's really exciting to think what you might see over the next 10, 15, 20 years in Western Africa and similar sort of markets.
This one is for Andrew. Marin is asking, what role will soy play in Egypt's economy?
Well, certainly we know that as the number one role of an economy is keep people fed. And if you see political unrest develop in places around the world, that's where you have food shortages and those type of challenges lead to issues. So food is always such a critical portion of any country's infrastructure plans and how they feed their people and how they run their country, obviously. And Egypt has made that conscious decision, and this isn't by mistake that they've made this decision. It's been intentional, right, to drive more of that key food production, key protein production in country versus having to import it. Yes, they're importing soybeans, but it's a little easier to import soybeans than it is to be reliant on importing all your protein products into the country through poultry and aquaculture. And I think Eric mentioned, I think we've all touched on it at some point here today, but it's a true axiom. And whether it is West Africa that Eric just talked about or the other places around the world, in Asia particularly, as folks get a little more money in their pockets, as they develop a little further, number one things they do is they want to consume higher quality foods, and often that means more protein in their diet. And a lot of these places, some folks don't eat meat every day, or a lot of places they don't. Sometimes it's only meat once, maybe twice a week. Well, if you increase that to 2, 3, 4 times a week, that's a dramatic increase in the demand for protein in those marketplaces. And it's one of the reasons why China accelerated so fast when it did. You had folks who went from eating meat once a week or less common to eating it every day and several times a day. And obviously the explosion in demand for meat products, protein, and of course the feedstocks to help grow and raise that protein. So back to Egypt, I think as Egypt is a developing country, kind of one of the we used to use the term BRIC, it used to be Brazil, Russia, India, China. That term probably could be expanded out quite a bit nowadays. Egypt definitely is a regional, cornerstone of what Middle East and North Africa is going to do. They're a developed country. They have more developed economic systems, and therefore to grow even further as the rest of that region grows. So could there be an even increased demand for protein and demand for poultry and fish products over the next few years in Egypt? Absolutely. I think that's what everyone's seeing. So it's central to their economy. As it grows, their demand will grow, and that's certainly an undeniable trend we've seen around the world. And whether that's going to happen in West Africa and Egypt and all these places, it's probably true. As more people get more dollars in their pockets, they spend those dollars, tend to spend that discretionary food dollars on protein, and we're well sourced to provide the feed for that protein as it goes forward.
For those who are Drew, how is the Illinois Soybean Association equipped to continue the growing export of soybeans to Egypt?
Sure. So we have a lot of things that make us well positioned to do exports of soybeans. And Mark highlighted probably one of our key advantages over even other states, over other countries, is that our export system works, right? We have developed a great model of sending our soybeans efficiently and the least cost down the Illinois and Mississippi, in some cases the Ohio River, depends in Illinois where you are, sending product down the rivers on barges and exporting out of New Orleans on bulk vessels, being the most cost-effective way to get our product to market. That is some people take that for granted, and obviously I think that's Mark's point earlier, is that we have to continue to really tell that story that this is an advantage we have, and let's not lose it. Let's not have that infrastructure go away. While we do have that infrastructure, Brazil's building infrastructure every day. There's no doubt about that, but they don't have that advantage that we have, that centralized exit route for our ag commodities to go out of a major port infrastructure like New Orleans. I mean, I think, harken back to the Brazilian harvest last year, and we know that they had a hard time getting trucks. They had massive rains, and they're claying soils, and a lot of the roads aren't, if they're paved, they're not well paved. They had a lot of issues. That's an advantage we have to serving these type of customers like Egypt. And that reflects in buying decisions, how reliably folks can get soybeans. Obviously, when we're selling soybeans on the market as the US, Brazil is not, right? Because we're on opposite growing cycles with where they're situated. So sometimes this relationship is always going to be cyclical, where Brazil is selling when we're not, and not vice versa. But oftentimes, it's that reliability of business, knowing they continue to get the product, which really does situate Illinois and the U.S. well to provide that customer in Egypt that product year over year over year. And I think another area, from at least we've heard from our farmer leaders in the last few years, as we talk to groups like USEC and other organizations, is that we want to diversify markets, right? We know what happens when we were as dependent on China, and we will always send beans to China. We even did during the trade war. They were still our top customer during the trade war, which I think is lost a lot of times. But there's an interest in finding these Egypts, Pakistans, and Eric mentioned West Africa, Nigeria, and those places develop over the next few years. Continually being able to service some of those customers that are emerging is a really strong business model for the U.S. soybean industry, and something that I know as an organization we're focused on continuing to service and guide our exporters and export advocates in that direction of making sure we can service those new and emerging markets.
Mark, for your fellow soybean farmers, especially in Illinois, why should they be taking note of countries like Egypt?
Well, that's where our future soybeans are going to go, hopefully. We just need to keep expanding our markets and be diligent in our looking forward. Where's the best place to put our money, and we as farmers need to know where they're going so that we can produce what they want. If they want more protein in their soybeans, well, we can select soybeans that are a little bit higher in protein. We just have to be aware of it and communicate it and tell our seed companies, and work together on this to increase our exports.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our conversation today, so I want to give a last call for anybody in the audience who has questions. If you're joining us on the webinar, you can put those in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. On Facebook Live, you are welcome to ask questions as well, and I'll look for those here right after we get some final comments from each of our panelists. Mark, go ahead and just kind of summarize some things for us if there's anything else you'd like to touch on.
Well, I just want to emphasize that what Illinois Soybean Association is doing, I think they're doing a great job, and our checkoff dollars are being spent worthwhile, and it takes a lot of work and effort. And I'd just like to thank the Brownfield Network for putting this on today. And Rand, it's nice to have been on. Appreciate it.
Eric, any final comments from you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is some of the most fun aspects of my work involved is talking about markets. And as Mark mentioned, it's so crucial that we understand these markets well. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen so many reasons why we really not only need to foster our current markets like China and Taiwan and Indonesia that are well developed, ones that we understand really well. We also need to put efforts and look at other markets like Egypt, like the MENA region, and continue to develop those, as it remains really crucial that we're leading the way in understanding that there are new markets developing. There are markets that can, with our help, get some additional expansion. And I'm excited to be part of it. I think ISA does just an outstanding job of being part of those markets, being part of the conversations involved, assisting with any challenges related to trade. So I'm excited to be part of it.
Andrew?
So I want to go back to my opening comment that it is exciting to see where these markets are. And I really do, as Eric mentioned, it is really a rewarding part of our work here as an organization to see where these markets and new customers come online. You don't get an Egypt type market pop up every year, but it's exciting to kind of continue to monitor those and see where we can find those new soybeans. I know particularly, we talked a lot about the China situation, but it really has been a focus of the organization in the last few years, not just Illinois soybean, of course, but our national groups like the United Soybean Export Council in working in places to try and develop demand for our soybean products around the world. And when they came to us with the idea of funding what they call the Soy Excellence Center program around the world, which is really meant to have that think tank, that resource for emerging poultry, aqua, in some countries, pork producers in specific markets, Egypt being one of them, to help them really get their businesses built up, get them using a lot more soybean meal, and making sure that they're efficient and being able to continue to buy our product, giving them educational resources. It's really been a strong program that they're really excited to continue to promote going forward throughout the world. I know they have facilities the Soy Excellence Center in Nigeria, they're building one in Honduras, to service all the countries in Central America. And there are a couple, of course, in Southeast Asia as well. And I think in talking with Mark and other directors in our farmer leaders in our association, really seeing that our support for those, using our checkoff dollars and supporting those or USEC in those places directly in market has been a really exciting development. Because a lot of times in trade and exports, you feel like you're going to take a little bit what the market provides, but this is a way to go out there and try to build that demand, build that reliable customer relationship in a lot of these countries, and really exciting and rewarding work. And I'm excited to see where we can go in some of these places and continue to export more quality U.S. soybeans.
All right. Thank you, three, for all of your comments. We do have just a couple of final questions from the audience that we'll wrap up with. So I'll just ask these, and whoever is willing to take it, I will let you. Did the Suez Canal being closed this spring affect soybeans that were there in Egypt?
I guess I can take that. We certainly monitored that situation very closely because it had impacts on the rest of global trade, and there may have been some soybean containers going other places through the Suez Canal on some of the ships that got backed up. But the good news is, from an infrastructure perspective, is when a ship goes through the Mediterranean, all the ports in Egypt that offload bulk soybeans are on the north side of the country, so they were able to get there with unrestricted flow from the U.S. and didn't disrupt that market.
And the last one here, maybe give a call to action for our Illinois farmers. Is there anything they can be doing to help support this market right now and kind of the future endeavors that ISA is looking at?
Well, I think Mark gave a pretty good call to action earlier about helping share the story about our infrastructure needs, because that's obviously an advantage, and sometimes we don't connect infrastructure and exports directly together, but there really is, it's the highway and vehicle to get there. Mark did a great job of describing the whole process and the way that soybeans get to market, and making sure that that important pathway, that important cog in that transportation system of the inland waterways remains a reliable asset. And even in some cases through programs like the Navigation Ecosystem Preservation, which is improving 1,200-foot lock chambers on the lower Mississippi and lower Illinois. That would be a really huge way to continue to assure we can have reliable and cost-effective access of our products to our export terminals and export customers.
But
All right.
one thing also, we can't use our checkoff dollars to lobby and that sort of thing. So that's up to us farmers to make calls to our congressmen and make our voices heard. Our checkoff money is going to increase our exports and things like that. It's not going to be for government policies. So if you have a strong feeling, let your legislators know we do have a voice. So just use it.
Thank you, Mark. Well, that wraps up our virtual conversation today on emerging soybean markets in Egypt. I'd like to thank each of our panelists, Mark Reed, Andrew Larson, and Eric Woody, for their time and their insight today, as well as the Illinois Soybean Association for sponsoring today's conversation, and all of our listeners for attending. For more information, you can visit ilsoy.org and ilsoy.org/Egypt. And then this full conversation from today will be available to view at brownfieldagnews.com. I'm Rhiannon Branch reporting for Brownfield.